So the first thing I want to do, we'll open it up to questions, but I want to just from like the morning. I just want to go around the room and just like let me know like what your like biggest takeaway from like the morning was, and what was like the number one thing that you learned today.
Well, pretty much almost everything, but the warm-ups were really helpful.
Cool. So the warm up, what particularly about like the warm up do you find is going to be really beneficial for you, like
How
moving
to
forward?
stretch my back especially, because I noticed when I do deadlifts, my neck always hurts. So when I was doing the stretch, I noticed that I kind of tense up a little bit more.
Okay. So yeah, making sure that your back is prepared to train, I think is going to be really good. So I think that's awesome. So cool. All right. What are some things that you learned today, Mike?
The mobility exercises, because I have a lot of issues with my hips, so that's going to help a lot in the future. And warming up for deadlifts instead of using reverse hyper, I'll do some of those mobility exercises.
Yeah, I mean, and there's like many different ways to skin a cat. Is made, so like the warm up system that we've kind of produced has gotten really great results, and hopefully you can see there's like a specific purpose for each of the movements, and they're going to get you ready for like the lifts that you're doing. So I think that's, and just to kind of recap, like I said, the big things that you want to focus on is activating the upper back, the trunk and like the core muscles, the abs, and then the glutes and like the hips, and then working some sort of mobility for like your hips, your ankles, and your upper back and shoulders. And if you have a squat day, some things that kind of mimic more of a squat pattern, some things, if you're on a bench press day, it could be specific based on the movements that you want to do, so for that day.
I liked how assessing where people are with mobility, because even though some of the clients I train aren't necessarily powerlifters, it's just good to see where their starting point is for exercising in general.
Yeah, I think assessment can be a tricky thing, and look, we're not doctors, we're not trying to prescribe or fix anything, but just understanding like where the joint range of motion is, like where respecting their body, I think is big. And I think a lot of people, like a lot of times, the analogy that we use is like a lot of times we're kind of throwing grenades when we're trying to figure out stance width and grip width and things like that. But if you could just do a quick assessment, get the athlete on the floor, and actually like look at like their hip range of motion, look at their shoulder range of motion, look at their internal, external rotation, their hip flexion, their shoulder flexion. You can get a big picture of kind of how they're going to move, and it can give you some good information. So I think that's a great takeaway.
Yeah, I like the mobility aspect too, due to the fact that it will show you like how to actually execute your lifts. Because like I'm a wide bench gripper, but now I'm gonna come in closer due to the fact that my mobility is a little bit better than what I thought. You know, I thought I was really stiff, and so mobility definitely gonna help me figure out where my weak points and my strong points are at.
And then I know we did like the workout this morning. We did a little dynamic squat workout, and then we worked some of the leg. What are some things that you learned like during the workout, and that you find maybe are going to be beneficial to you like moving forward with like your training? What are some things that you like kind of learned this morning, Sue?
Well, this morning, just sit back and stay tight. I usually you get box squats, and I usually just come down on a box and to try to explode up, instead of actually controlling the movement all the way down and actually finding where the muscle groups are. Usually I just want to lift, instead of actually executing what I need to execute to get stronger in the long term.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between like moving the weight from point A to point B and actually moving it with intent, keeping that full body tension, making sure like the muscles that you're trying to train are actually active, and you're kind of focusing on using those muscles. I think is really important. And like you said, I think a lot of people, they're just, especially on like a speed day, we can get really wrapped up with just trying to move the weight quickly, but we want to move the weight with good quality movement as well, and that's going to transfer better, and it's going to keep you healthier in the long run. So just having an intent and a purpose for the exercises you're doing, and understanding the intent of the day is going to be really beneficial. So that was good. And then I think a lot of us, I think in the powerlifting world too, we can get really like caught up with like just training our posterior chain all the time. But it's like also let's not forget to like work our legs too and our quads, because sometimes that can be neglected. The pendulum can kind of swing a little bit too far, like one direction. And if you train your whole body like it's weak, and you kind of make the whole body like strong, you're not going to have any weak points, and you're going to be a more well-rounded lifter. So I think that's big.
I think the biggest takeaway for me was the difference between breathing and bracing, and then also actually keeping certain muscles tight. Like you said, like when you squat, most people think keep tight by taking a big breath with your chest, but then you're neglecting the actual belt and bracing of it to keep your spine in a neutral position. can still do that, but you can also still tighten up with your back, so you know, actually perform
Yeah.
correctly.
I think that's great point. We talked about in the beginning, we want to do simple things savagely well. And I think a lot of us, if we were like involved in powerlifting, we kind of know that a big breath can be important. I think we know that getting tight is important, but like to what degree does that mean? And I think all of us probably, we were able to get a little bit tighter than we thought. There's always a little bit more. There's always a little bit more tension. There's always a little bit more activation that you can get. And even though we probably work on these things, you could always get a little bit better each day. So just trying to get a little bit incrementally better each day, I think, is big. And just something like you said, simple, like versus just getting a little bit more kind of air lower and then using our diaphragm a little more effectively. Because like we all breathe like every day, but actually just doing it a little bit better. So.
As you mentioned, just like analyzing the beginning on your ranges of motion, how that can affect how you do different things for as far as putting your feet forward when you squat, or being blinder, where your stance is, where your hands go for squatting as well. I thought that was really interesting. And the bracing technique to make sure you're not just bringing the belly out, but you came through, make sure the glutes are coming out, and then also in the back as well. I never even thought about laying on my stomach and seeing how tight the back got.
Yeah, I think kind of goes back to like some cues that are good and kind of some cues can go wrong. And there's really no good or bad cue, but just how you if it helps you move mechanically better, I think that's important. And I think a lot of us sometimes, especially as we get heavier in weight, we can use the belt as a crutch, and we may only be pushing like forward, and we're not really getting good engagement from our obliques, or we're not really kind of pushing into that lower back. But if we can get that circumferential expansion, you're just going to be that much tighter, and you're going to be able to produce more force into the bar. So I think that's great. So cool. Yeah, anytime I do any of these seminars, I always it's like a lot of like the really simple stuff on the floor. I think people get the most out of, and that's like kind of the stuff that kind of keeps you healthy, keeps you in better positions. And then, like I said, if you are a coach, if you just spend a little bit more time in the front end, when you actually get to the barbell, they're going to have a lot of these skills already. They're going to understand, like, when you tell them to engage their lats, you tell them to brace, they're going to they've already practiced all these movements and these skills already, so they're going to be that much more effective once you actually get to the bar. And then a lot of times the technique and the squat, the bench, the deadlift, they'll kind of take care of themselves because they have all those fundamental patterns ingrained already. So I want to kind of open up the floor now a little bit. Anything powerlifting or strength related is kind of fair game. I know, I've also been I'm not an expert in nutrition, but I do have my precision nutrition certification. So if you guys have any questions on diet or nutrition, powerlifting, coaching, anything that's kind of in that under that umbrella, kind of open up the floor and we'll kind of go around. And this is the time to ask, so don't be shy. And what do you guys have?
I can show you.
Yeah, sure.
So super random, we were just talking about each day and eating, so you're talking about nutrition.
Okay, eating.
Real hard to eat on competition day, just because of adrenaline, if you're taking a lot of caffeine, things like that, it's just hard to put
Yeah,
food
great
down.
question.
So we'll kind of
So a couple of things for competition day. So there's a couple of things to consider. If you're in a federation like a USPA or a USAPL, usually they run a little faster versus something like maybe an RPS or I would say the RPS runs smooth, but it's usually a little bit longer. Typically, if you're in a flight with people with equipment or monoliths, or if there's a lot of knee wrap lifters, it's going to take longer. So these are things to consider: is the federation you're doing, the meet director, how long you kind of expect. The nutrition on game day actually starts the night before, so that's going to be really important. Did you do a big weight cut? Did you not weight cut at all? So what's going to be really important is after you weigh in, depending on if you cut or not, is replenishing to what your normal training weight is. And if you didn't do a cut, obviously that's still important. So there's a couple of things to consider. So making sure that you have enough carbohydrate and glycogen kind of fueled up. It's going to be really important. If you have a 2-hour weigh-in, the strategy is also going to be different as well. If in a 2-hour weigh-in situation like a USAPL meet, you're probably gonna have to do a lot more liquids and fast-acting things because you don't have as much time to replenish like the night before. In a 24-hour weigh-in situation, a lot of times you could probably get enough food in to kind of at least give you enough calories, energy, and glycogen to get you through the day. And then once you kind of get to game day itself, some of the biggest things that's gonna be really important is staying hydrated, especially if it's if you're doing a summer meet, so you're doing a meet coming up soon. Is there going to be air conditioning? Is it going to be really hot? Is there going to be a lot of like 300-pound dudes in the warm-up room that's going to make it even hotter? So the electrolytes and the hydration is key. So one of the things I like to use Noon tabs that have sodium. They have a little bit of potassium and a little bit of magnesium. And another product that I've been experimenting lately is also it's a powder, and I'm not affiliated with any of these companies. I just like to use the Noon, but also LMT. There's a company, Elemental Labs. It's a powder, and it has a little bit more sodium and a little bit more magnesium than the Noon, but both are good. But basically, the more you sweat and the hotter it is, you're going to lose more electrolytes, and that's going to, especially for the bigger guys, especially that sweat a lot. Cramping can become an issue, especially after the squat, and then once you get into the bench press and the deadlift. When I was coaching a couple of years ago, when I was coaching Larry Williams at Boss of Bosses for the first time, this was the first time he broke the all-time record at 242. We had to actually pass on his third bench attempt because he was cramping so bad, and we had to get electrolyte tabs. So from then on, I always stocked Noon tabs for Larry, and he has not cramped at a meet since. So we're constantly making sure he gets enough sodium throughout the day. So before each lift, we'd have a couple of Noon tabs and making sure his sodium is up before each attempt. So before squat, you'd have some Noon and and a lot of sodium. Before bench press, before deadlift. So before each before each event, we would make sure you'd get some hydration and some sodium back in the system, and that's going to help prevent cramping and allow for better force production. So the sodium, especially, but like the sodium, the potassium, and the magnesium can be really helpful for muscle contraction and to prevent cramping. So number one is your hydration. The second thing, I would keep the fats very low on game day. So one of the things that drives me nuts, and I know everyone's got different rituals and stuff, is when someone goes to weigh in, and then they go to like the diner and they have a lot of pancakes and bacon and syrup, and they eat clean this whole prep, and then they start to eat a lot of junk. Especially when it becomes like things like wheat, which maybe you don't digest as well, or maybe foods they're not familiar with, or just a lot of fat. Fat's going to slow down the digestion, and it's not going to allow you to get nutrients into your body as quickly. So we want to keep the fats lower. More of like a moderate, protein, just to kind of make sure that you have enough like amino acids in the body, and then it's mostly going to be like moderate to higher carbohydrate. I like a lot of Stan Efferding stuff. I really like kind of like the vertical diet kind of principles. I'll just do like a lot of meat and rice, and then on game day I just do smaller portions than I normally do. So I just have a little bit of rice and like salt, and I might have some meat. I might not even have some meat, but just having some carbohydrate and some salt on like rice, for example, you can digest it quickly. If you normally have kind of sugar and Gatorades and stuff, like quicker carbohydrates on game day is going to be a good thing. If you don't really feel like you have the stomach to kind of digest, like doing more liquids, whether it's like maltodextrin or different like carbohydrate powders and things like that, those could be effective as well. But just making sure you're getting carbohydrates, some sodium throughout the day. And the other biggest mistake I see people make is loading up on too much caffeine before the squat, and then by the time they get to the deadlift, they crash. So a good rule of thumb is let's say like you normally have like 1 scoop of like pre-workout, or if you have like a specific amount of caffeine, like maybe it's 150 milligrams or 200 milligrams of caffeine before like you train, I would have a smaller dose and split it up throughout the day. So if you normally have like 200 milligrams of caffeine, maybe you have like 75 milligrams of caffeine before you squat, and then another 75 milligrams of caffeine before you bench. And then maybe if you need a little kick, save the kick for the deadlift when you need it. So then you maybe have 100 or 150 grams of caffeine before you deadlift. Because a lot of people load up on the pre-workout before they squat. They may have a good squat performance, and then they crash by the time they get to the deadlift because they have this caffeine like kind of dump, and then their energy levels really go. So you want to try to spread out the caffeine, and you want to spread out like your nutrition evenly throughout the day. You don't want to load up on too much of any one thing before you squat. That's like a big mistake I see people make. The biggest thing is just make sure that whatever your routine is, it's foods that you normally eat. I would have it in a little bit smaller quantities, and then like I said, make sure your hydration and like your caffeine is kind of spaced out. But does that kind of answer your question, or if anybody follow up? So that's kind of like how I'd approach game day. Everyone's gonna have different rituals and stuff. Some people might prefer more liquids than food. Like I said, I like to again keep sodium high, carbohydrates moderate, fat very low, and then like moderate or no protein, just to kind of keep the digestion like kind of going. So, any other questions?
I guess one more question. I don't know if you talked about it before I got here. When you're trying to you end up either gaining a lot of weight, losing a lot of weight, feeling a lot stronger, starting to feel tighter, or you're just not getting as much through your workout to see if anything's changed with your mobility, so that you can either focus more on mobility or focus more on strength.
So yeah, for the first part is like, when should you assess? So if you're a coach listening to this, or if you're a coach that's here, I think like day one is a good time to do an assessment, or like it could be like the start of a new training block. So let's say if you normally do like 12 or 16 week training cycles, that might be a good time to test and like retest. If you're dealing with an injury or coming back from sort of injury, so let's say like I recently kind of hurt my shoulder, so I might, if you have dealing with an injury or coming back from an injury, I might test a little bit more frequently, maybe even every workout potentially, just because you're kind of trying to get back to like a baseline. But if your training is going really well and you have like your stance and your kind of mechanics really dialed in, I would just like assess like as needed. There's also certain movements that I like to do that's kind of a warm up and an assessment. So like I taught him like the leg lowers today. So that'll also, even though that's a warm up for him, that's also going to be an indicator usually of like how his hips are functioning. So if his leg lowers feel really comfortable and like stable that day, usually he's probably going to have a good deadlift session. So I know for me, for sumo deadlift, a big indicator for me is a shin box, which I can kind of go through in a little bit, but it's basically a 90-90 hip position. And I know like when my shin box get up is feeling really good, I know I'm going to get into a really good sumo deadlift position for that day. If it doesn't feel really good, that's going to tell me I'm going to need to spend a little bit more time warming up and kind of greasing my hips a little bit and making sure I have enough mobility to get into that position. So you'll kind of start to figure out like if a certain movement feels like good or bad. That's going to kind of give you like, okay, I need to spend a little bit more time on my mobility today, or maybe I need to spend a little bit more time on like doing a little more activation stuff. And you start to kind of tweak your kind of warm-ups based on how you're feeling and like what your body needs. But yeah, in general, just like kind of assess as needed. I would assess kind of the beginning of a training block, and I would assess yourself. And maybe you're trying to like, maybe you're a lifter that's transitioning from like a sumo stance to a conventional stance, or a conventional stance to a sumo stance. If you're trying to use a new technique or add a new movement into your routine, that's also a good time to throw an assessment. And maybe you want to start overhead pressing. Well, let's check your shoulder flexion if you want to kind of add that into your routine. So does that kind of give you some good feedback and any other follow-up questions or?
Like I said, I think it's pretty much answered. It's just like, you know, like you said, if you're going through a training block, you get it done with it in like maybe the last like couple weeks or something, you just hadn't felt like you were getting up to a certain thing, like maybe you retest yourself to see if,
Sure.
you know, maybe you just got a little tighter in your hips and now you have to widen your stance out to
Yeah.
see if that's going to transfer over.
And I'll say too, if you have a huge, whether it's gaining weight or losing weight, if you have a big difference in like your body weight, so like as I've lost weight, like my conventional deadlift has had to tighten up a lot, you know, and like for example, so as your body changes, your leverages change too, so that could be also an indication that you may need to change up your technique a little bit to suit your body a little bit better also.
So training, I like training older women who just want to kind of stay in shape, get fit, and not hurt themselves. How is it important is it to incorporate like squat bench?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that I do with people is your process is going to be different, but this is something you could potentially add in or kind of put a little spin on it. So what I like to do like day one, I like doing a quick assessment with them, especially if now. But I also want to make sure like for like an older person versus like an athlete, I might not like tell them I'm assessing them. I might just be like, oh, this is our warm up, and I might just like frame it a little bit different because I don't want them to feel like we're kind of playing doctor where they're getting like a score. So my approach is going to be a little bit different with them. I might just have them do like, oh, this is our warm up. I might like, not that I'm lying, but I'm just framing it like different. So this is our warm up today. I just want to see how you're moving. We're going to work on your like, you know, flex. So I might like talk to them different. That's the first thing. Whereas like someone like him, like he's not like going to be as shy about like getting like assessed or whatever. Even that word can maybe kind of be frightening to people. So how you frame it and how you talk to them is going to be different. And at the end of the first session, I like to sit down and do like a little bit of like a goal setting with them. And let's say their goal is I want to lose weight, which is very common, or I want to get in shape for summer, I want to like fit in my bikini. All that stuff is great. And what I like to do is just kind of probe them a little bit more and try to keep asking like why, and just so they know that I want to know like, is it actually important to them? because I'm sure a lot of people kind of come in here and all these numbers, if I want to lose 10 pounds or 6-pack, a lot of this stuff is very superficial and arbitrary, but they probably want to feel better. They probably want better quality of life. They probably want to have more confidence. So like those are the things that you want to like dive deep and understand why they're doing this. And then I would, as a coach, I would make it more prescriptive and be like, okay, well, you told me that this is your goal. We learned this is why. This is your reason why. I want to be more fit so I can play with my kids or whatever. So now you kind of understand where they're coming from, and you have a little bit more leverage to be like, hey, if this is your goal and this is important to you, one of the best ways to kind of achieve this is getting stronger. And one of the best things that you can do to get stronger is we're going to do these heavy compound movements. And you don't even have to say like we're powerlifting. Just be like, so we're definitely going to, and then maybe you don't even tell them, but maybe the next couple of sessions you start to teach them how to squat, you teach them how to deadlift. And maybe you start them off with their body weight, or maybe you start them off with their kettlebell. But they're doing strength training, and the strength training is just a means for them to get to their goal. Whereas strength training is a means for him to get ready for the platform. Strength training is just a means for them to feel better, have more confidence, lose some weight, and just have better quality of life. So you're still using powerlifting as a tool. The tool is just accomplishing a different task, and it's accomplishing a different job. So it's just how you frame it. And the other thing, I'm just not going to be as aggressive. I'm going to just slowly add more. One thing that you have a lot of plates and stuff. I have half pound and 1 pound plates, so you can make very small jumps with the smaller limit, especially on a bench press. You might not be able to increase by 5 pounds for a while. So be able to hit a 1 pound or a 2 pound PR, so this they can have that win. They get a little bit of the less focus on the scale. They start to feel good about the performance, and it's also going to have them. They're going to look better, they feel better. So yeah, I think it's how you frame it, but just show them that this is a means to get them toward their goal. And like I said, our podcast and some of the things we call it's powerlifting for the people, because we really believe that the strength training is for everybody. It's just to what level. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool.
Can I jump off that?
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Just while we're on the topic.
Yep.
So when do you start to, because a lot of the lifts like the squat and the bench and deadlift, it seems really simple, you just pick the bar. We all know that it's a lot more technical than that. At what point was somebody you see talking about, you start bringing up those technical aspects
Yeah.
of the lift?
Sure. So from day one, but it's just when we're dealing with older population or someone that's brand new. So a lot of the drills, you want to not foolproof, you want to do exercises that are kind of more idiot proof. So for example, if you start them off with a kettlebell squat, a kettlebell squat's a great example of an exercise that is self-correcting, because if you start to fold over at the back, you're literally going to dump the weight forward. So if one of their problems, their technical issues, so the kettlebell becomes the coach. Does that kind of make sense? So you use exercises like that. So that's kind of a really good example. If they're not squatting low enough, you have them start off to a box that they can kind of handle. Using the squat with the RNT, they're going to get feedback right away without you even having to cue them. They'll be like, hey, I just want to make sure you keep tension on this band. And then you kind of explain to them why they're doing that and stuff. So you just kind of give them a little thing. The other thing I think is important, especially when you're teaching new people, is that you just try to focus on maybe fixing one problem at a time, and usually the biggest problem. So a lot of people, that's going to be knees caving in, back rounding, that kind of thing. So just focus on one correction at a time, because if someone has 20 things wrong or 10 things wrong, they're not going to be able to correct everything all at once. So usually starting with a good setup, the breathing and bracing, the activation, and if you take those steps like we did today, if they do the breathing and bracing in the warm-up, and they do glute activation and lat activation in the warm-up, by the time you get to the squat, they kind of hopefully already worked on some of those skills that they're going to need anyway. So it's going to allow you to kind of speed up the coaching process a little bit. So does that make sense? So yeah, so it's and then sometimes using my dad's a good example. He's got 2 fake hips. I just have him belt squat. He doesn't squat with the bar, and he may never squat with the bar, and that's just going to be the progression he stays at. There's no need to push it. Whereas my mom, she squats with the bar now. It took her a while. She started off with her body weight to a high box, and we got her to a low box, and we had her to a kettlebell, to a high box, to a low box. Then we had a kettlebell without the box, and then it was the empty bar for a while. And now she is 61, and she could do about 100 pounds for a couple of reps, and she gets good depth. But it was a 2-year process, and it's fine, because there's no rush. Like she's not like doing a competition. She's not trying to like, you know, set an all-time world record, and you just slow and steady. Because like not everyone's as crazy as us that we want to hit these like PRs every week and you know, and put 800 pounds on our back. But for the average person, they just want to feel good, and you know, and sometimes if someone's really just bad at a certain movement, it's okay to like, let's just focus on their strengths for a little bit and just do something they could be successful with. You know, because I think that's something that I've made mistakes in the past. You try to like rush, like get them to the straight bar right away. I think that's like a mistake. Like you can take your time with like the adults and just slowly progress them. So.
What's your opinion on a trap bar versus straight bar
Yeah.
for someone who's learning how to deadlift?
So there's a couple of things. I think the trap bar so at my facility and what we do, I've gone back and forth with this. We actually ended up getting rid of our trap bars, and the main reason is that we train mostly groups. If you're working with a one-on-one client, I think it's a great option to have. It's going to be a little bit easier on the shoulders. It's going to be a little bit easier to learn. The downside of the trap bar that can be tough for people with like low back pain and stuff like that, the start is going to be more low back friendly, just because you're literally in the center of the bar. The problem with the trap bar, which and there's ways around this, which like you can add like bands or chains to it, but once you get to the top, it's you don't have the bar to kind of push into to kind of lock you in place. So a lot of times you'll get hyperextension at the lockout with the trap bar. So that's the one thing you could avoid that by doing a band resistant trap bar or putting chains on the front and the back just to kind of help like make sure the athlete's more grounded. So that's the only downside to the trap bar, but other than that, again, if someone is not a competitive lifter, it's a little bit less stress on the spine, besides the caveat I just mentioned. You could do a high handle or like a low handle or off blocks and make it very like do like a good hip height which they can control. And if someone has like a wrist or shoulder injury or something, the neutral grip's gonna be a little bit more comfortable. I will say that most people though tend to make the trap bar a little bit more of like a squatting motion. So if you want to use it as a deadlift variation to work your glutes and hamstrings, just doing it with a little bit of a higher hip position and making sure that they're in a true hinge and not actually squatting the weight to make sure that you're working the muscle groups that you want. So it just depends on what you're using the exercise for. But I do think I think there are benefits to the straight bar deadlift. Just like I said, like getting the hips through at the top and things like that. But again, it just depends on like what's the context of it. If they're not a competitive power lifter and you just want them to do some sort of deadlift variation to work their glutes and hamstrings, I think it's a fine variation. Like I said, I use my dad as the example. Like a belt squat is not a competition movement, but the belt squat serves the purpose for him to take stress off his spine, it works his hips, it works his legs, and he's able to do that successfully. Whereas the straight bar, it's like a little bit outside his like kind of comfort level right now.
So, sport-specific training, like say they're training for baseball, lacrosse, or football, when it comes to compound movements, what would you suggest?
So going back to what we said before, depending on if you're training someone one-on-one or in a group setting, that's going to be a logistic kind of thing. If I was training like a baseball player like one-on-one, you want to think about the limitations and the demands. So a baseball player, any overhead athlete, they're going to be putting a lot of stress on the shoulder. So you want to consider the shoulder health, you want to consider the demands of the sport. So doing something like a safety squat bar versus a straight bar would be a good option for a baseball player because it's going to accomplish the same muscle groups as a barbell squat, but take the stress off the shoulder. So that would be like a good example. They don't ever have to straight bar squat because they're not a competitive lifter. Doing like a floor press or a board press versus a full range bench press. They don't ever have to do a straight bar bench. They could do a football bar bench. Deadlift's probably doing more hook grip or double overhand, so they're not, having those imbalances in there, or just deadlifting with straps. Again, they don't have to deadlift, since they're not like competing it's just for them. Strength training is just general physical preparedness. It's just a means to get them better. It should be a means to give them a bigger base of their pyramid, to allow them to have more strength, and more strength can translate to more speed and more power. So you want to think about what's going to be more joint friendly for them, what's going to match the velocity and more the mechanics of the sport. So something like baseball, high velocity sport, so working more strength speed and speed strength versus like absolute strength all the time. Something like, like a lot of those sports, if something is more endurance based, maybe they don't need to be as explosive, but making someone stronger and faster and more powerful is always going to help And as far as like sports specific training, it kind of goes back to like where they are in a training cycle and where they are in their season. Are they early off season? Are they late off season? Are they pre-season? Are they in season? So the closer you get to their in season, the closer you get to an important competition, the less they're going to do strength training, the less they're going to do general physical preparedness, and the more they're going to do sports specific training and sports specific skills. So as someone gets, so using the baseball player as an example, in the off season, you might be working more absolute strength, so like heavy safety squat bar, maybe heavy trap bar deadlift or heavy sumo block pulls, heavy football bar bench. They're going to really try to get stronger and bigger in the off season. And as we get closer to preseason, then you do more dynamic effort training. You start to do more jumps and things like that. And then in season, it's going to be more of like, I hate to use the word maintenance, but you're not going to be worried about absolute strength anymore. Maybe you're taking less stressful movements away. Maybe they're doing more single leg work. Maybe they're doing mostly jumps and medicine ball throws, because that's going to have a higher transfer. Throwing a baseball is more of like a speed event versus, so like throwing a baseball would be like over here, very specific, very high velocity. Over here, something like a safety squat bar would be like for their absolute strength. Throwing a medicine ball would be like over here. Doing like a dynamic dock squat with bands would be like kind of over here. So depending on where they are in the season, you're going to spend more time in like a certain like area. So try to like, without reading you like a science and practices of strength or any of these complex texts, but that's kind of like in a nutshell like how to approach it. And it really comes down to the individual. But for most people that are coming into you, they're going to need to get stronger. They're going to need to get bigger. And that's going to give them a bigger base, because strength is going to improve all physical qualities. The stronger you are, you're going to be able to be faster. It's going to be less of a percentage of what your 1 rep max to take a bigger step, to take a jump, be absolutely strong. And then I said the other thing I would just consider with athletes is making sure that their lean body mass is in check. Because if they get too fat, they might be getting stronger, but if their absolute strength if their relative strength goes down, it's not necessarily the best trade-off. So doing something like push-ups and pull-ups and things like that, which kind of take into account their body weight, is also a good idea for like athletes too, because they got to be strong pound for pound as well. So. It's okay. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So say it's like a new client comes to you and, you know, they're just starting out, but their main goal is to get to the platform. Would you suggest doing a 12-week program and then seeing where they're at, just like get rid of the platform fright, or would you suggest, I mean, I know it varies depending on the client, but how would you approach that?
Yeah, it really depends on the person. So the first thing, I mentioned with Sam before, when dealing with a new client, I want to hear their goal, and I want to know why their goal, and then I want to try and get to read that person. So, like when you reached out to me, I knew that you had experience competing already. I knew that you were a former athlete, so I knew that you can kind of throw it into the mix, and it wouldn't be like a huge, I guess, mental kind of challenge. Whereas other people, like, they might be really good in the gym, but they just don't have like the competition. Like, competing is a skill also. So like, even though you not competing, you haven't competed in powerlifting, like the fact that you had competed in other things, that was like a more general skill set, but that would allow you to be a little bit more successful when you transfer to another sport. Whereas I might have someone that's really, really strong, but if they're like, so like when Larry was 19 years old, that was a good example. Like, he never played any sports. So when he was 19, he had a lot of performance anxiety. He didn't really do well his first couple of meets. He bombed out of a lot. And it wasn't that, he was always strong enough to break world records, but he was not a great competitor when he was 19. Because he didn't have the skill of competing yet. He didn't have someone calling his numbers and things. And then once he started to trust me and then I started to call his numbers, his athleticism and his skill was allowed to shine, because now that performance anxiety was down, he had trusted the process, and he could just be like the athlete that he always was. And he was allowed to kind of really unleash his true potential. So it's really going to be dependent on the person. It's very individual. As far as someone, if they really truly do want to compete, because a lot of people say they want to compete, and that's like a different conversation. But if they do really want to compete, and I feel like it's going to be a good thing for them, I like to rip the Band-Aid off and just have them do a meet. I'm not really worried about them peaking. I'm not really worried about them hitting all-time PRs. I want them to try to go 8 or 9 for 9. And if they get hit like a PR or 2, I want them to hit a total, because I always tell people, your first meet, everything's a PR. You've never done a meet before. You don't have a total yet. You've never done a lift in front of judges. You've never done all 3 lifts in the same day under competition settings. You've never lifted in front of a crowd. So I like to rip the Band-Aid off. I don't really worry about having some fancy peak. There's no need to put so much pressure on it. And I want to actually see if they like it. Because they might train for a year or something. Like, I'm not ready yet. It's like, if you say that, you're never going to be ready. So I just throw them into a meet. Just have fun, low pressure, get a total. And then once you have the total, now you can be like, okay, I totaled 1,000 this time. I want to total 1,050 next meet. Or 1,045 or whatever. Whatever. I just want to do better than, and then you have a baseline to go off, and then you can then you can start to set goals, and then you could do the 8, the 10 week, the 16 week training cycle. And then once someone's kind of seasoned, I think anywhere from 12 to 16 week training cycles, where you have time for like a hypertrophy block, and then you have time for a strength block and a peaking phase, I think is a kind of a good length of time. So you can compete like 2 to 3, if you're newer, up to 4 times a year. But I like that kind of sweet spot of every 2 to 3 times a year, every 3 to 4 months, kind of going into a new program or potentially competing to get that platform experience. But yeah, it really depends on the person. But I think for the first one, I think people put way too much pressure on, like, I want to hit an elite total my first meet. I want to, like, I'm not going to compete until I hit this record. And I think that's like, you don't even know if you're going to like it. You don't know how you're going to do. And just do it, try it, see what happens, have fun, get a total, and then kind of let's go from there and just have fun with it. I think a lot of us forget like why we started this in the first place is we wanted to improve ourselves, we wanted to get better, we want to have fun doing it. I had no idea what I was doing. My first meet was 18. I missed the squat command. I did all this stuff. It's like, it didn't matter what I hit in the gym. It's like, but then I had a total, and then from there on, I just kept chipping away, and now 13 years later, and I've been doing it ever since, and I'm still, I plan on doing it for a long time. But I also think like making sure I rather the person hit lifts and have a good experience, and like you don't want them to bomb out the first meet. You don't want them to have a bad experience. So maybe don't do the most strict meet. Maybe do an in-house meet. Maybe do a mock meet. Maybe do a single lift. A lot of people don't do that. Just do something that's low pressure. So put them in a position where they're going to be successful. That way they have a positive experience, and then they can kind of like want to actually come back. The last thing you want them to do is spend 16 weeks training so hard, and then they bomb out, they don't reach their goals, and then it's like they're never going to want to do it again. So set them up for success, make sure they have fun, make sure they're successful, and yeah, it just, so it's hard to like give you an exact roadmap because everyone's different, but I would say just make sure they're successful, don't put too much pressure on it, and I think in general, I think ripping the Band-Aid off and just kind of doing it, and because sometimes, especially if it's like a quick turnaround, you don't have as much time to like think and stress over it, if you like, so I like to get people like in, first couple of months, someone's in my gym, I like to get them to do a meet if possible, and then just kind of go from there. And then we'll see if they actually like it and if they want to continue. Because I don't want to waste someone's time. I don't want someone to spend 6 months and then they hate it, and it's like, you don't get that time back. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Cool. Anybody else? All right, well, I just want to, again, thank Maggie and Sam for having me. Great seminar at Ironstone Barbell. If you're in the PA area, definitely check out the gym. It's fantastic. I know if I lived here, I would definitely be a member. And thank you guys for listening. If you guys are listening after the fact, thank you guys for listening. If you want to give this podcast a 5-star review, it helps other people find us. Thank you guys so much. And until next time, stay strong, and we'll see you soon.